The period after the destruction of the temple in the year 70 and then the Second Roman-Jewish War under Bar Kokhba in the 130s is an incredibly important period in the development of Jewish history in general. This is primarily because the Jewish people had to learn how to adapt themselves to a radically new environment. Without the temple, the fulcrum of their relationship between themselves and their God had disappeared, and they had to articulate a new way of centering that fundamental religious identity. Secondly, on a political level, there was no question that after two disastrous revolts, the Jews would not be able to budge the Roman Empire from their land. And so they had to find ways of organizing themselves in order to maintain group integrity, in order to maintain their identity, and in fact, they were quite successful at doing so. Many historians have described this period as the transition between the Tana'im and the Amoraim, very important terms. They're technical in nature. They refer really to periods in intellectual history. The Tana'im are the main teachers from the 1st century before the Common Era up until the early 3rd century of the Common Era, and their main activity was memorizing and teaching the Mishnah. That is the oral tradition that we discussed a few lectures ago, what exactly is the Mishnah, but these are the teachers who would play an incredibly important role in focusing Jewish energies on their continued spiritual life, which would of course be related very closely to their communal life, their identity, and ultimately their political life as well. The Amoraim, or the speakers, Tana'im means teachers, Amorim means speakers, these people are especially associated with the development of the Talmud, and there are Amoraim in Israel, and also more importantly in Babylonia, where the Babylonian Talmud would be developed. So the period of the Tana'im basically comes to a close at the beginning of the 3rd century. The Amoraim pick it up from there with their development of the Talmud, although the function of the Tana'im in terms of memorizing the Mishnah is still very relevant for centuries, but they will primarily be subservient to the Amoraim intellectually, in that they will be the repositories of all this memorized knowledge. Even when it is in a written form, there's still tremendous utility for people to have a massive intellectual storehouse of it, and the Amoraim will then be exploring it and discussing it, as I hope to discuss in the 2 lectures from now. At any rate, let's look at this period in a little more detail. So at the end of the destruction of the temple, perhaps the most important city after Jerusalem was a small town close to the coast called Yavneh. And as you may recall, there's a famous passage that we discussed earlier in the Talmud in which Yochanan ben Zakkai appeals to Vespasian, the future emperor of Rome, Ten li Yavneh v'chachameha. Give me Yavneh and its sages. There's some dispute over the historicity of that particular incident, and there's some interesting reflections on what role Berenice may have had in protecting Yavneh. But what we know for certain is that Yavneh itself became a major center for concentration of sages, at first under the leadership of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, later under Rabban Gamliel, and many others. Fascinating stories. I'd like to look at one specific episode that occurred in Yavneh that has some fascinating implications and illustrate, for our purposes, the sense of what's happening in terms of the intellectual refocus that's happening among the Jewish people at this time. This is a passage that occurs in the Talmud, Tractate Bava Metzia 59b, the Babylonian Talmud. The dispute centers on the status of a particular oven called the oven of Achnai. It's a particular design, and the rabbis are arguing as to whether or not it retains its ritual purity under certain circumstances. Basically, it boils down to 2 main sides of the argument. Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, the great sage, who tends to follow the teachings of Shammai. Or perhaps I should just make an interlude at this point. Shammai and Hillel are 2 of the greatest of the Zugot, the generation that preceded the Tana'im, and their teachings, which are by now like 200 years old, have created two large schools, the school of Shammai, Beit Shammai, and the school of Hillel, the school of Hillel. And up until the destruction of the temple, it seems that whether one followed Hillel or Shammai was largely a matter of personal choice. You would associate yourself with a particular school, and you would consistently follow the dictates of that school in terms of personal conduct, and they got along fairly well overall. They had tremendous amount of disputes over the law, but those disputes were famously solved quite amicably. Things changed after the destruction of the temple, however, as there is a consolidation of thought, primarily around the opinion of Hillel. At any rate, on the one side, we have Rabbi Eliezer Haggadol, very important rabbi who tends to follow the teaching of Shammai. And on the other side, the growing consensus, the majority vote, is following Hillel's opinion regarding how to deal with this oven. That is the house of Hillel. They're agreeing with Beit Hillel. Hillel is passed away quite for a long time now. And what ends up happening is really remarkable. The Talmud says that Rabbi Eliezer says, if the law follows my opinion, let this river reverse course. And the river does. And the rabbis say, doesn't matter. We follow the argument of logic, and you can bring as many supernatural proofs as you like. That's not how we decide things here. So then Rabbi Eliezer says, if the law follows my opinion, let these carob trees be uprooted and be sent along the road. And the rabbi, and then that actually happens. And then the rabbis say, doesn't matter. The Torah is something that we debate amongst ourselves, and majority rules. And then finally he says, if the law follows my opinion, let the walls of the Beit Medrash crumble. And they crumble. Then at one point one of the rabbis says, what to the walls, what are you doing? Why should you be involved in this? And so the walls, they don't collapse completely. They sort of like stay in a leaning place. And then finally, the same argument goes on and on. Rabbi Eliezer says then, if the law follows me, let the heavens proclaim it. And a booming voice comes out from the sky and says, the law follows the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And this looks like a slam dunk, right? You've got all these supernatural phenomena supporting Rabbi Eliezer, but the rabbis say, you can bring as many proofs as you want, but lo bashamayim hi, the law is not in heaven. The law is on earth, and on earth we follow majority rule. So Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is not followed. The dominant opinion, which is Beit Hillel, is followed in this particular case of this oven of Achnai. Two reasons why this is really important. Let me start with perhaps the less important but very interesting reason, and that is associated with the tsunami. So I had this great opportunity. I got a call from National Geographic about a year ago, and they said they want to talk to me, which I was really honored, about the research of Dr. Beverly Goodman, who is a geoarchaeologist working at the University of Haifa. Dr. Goodman has looked at a lot of fascinating historical data and has determined that the earthquake, which is described, for example, far away as Antioch in the year 115, probably destroyed ports along the coastline of Israel. And she argued, and this is why National Geographic wanted to ask me for my opinion. I don't know why me specifically, but it was really cool to get the call. Is it possible that the passage described in Bav Metzia is actually reflecting a historical event, a geological event, specifically a tsunami hitting the region of Yavneh in the year 115? Wow. And it's so interesting because all of the phenomena that are described there, beginning with the river running backwards, the carob trees flying away, the walls of the Beit Medrash beginning to crumble, and then later there's a discussion of huge storms at sea. They all make sense with this particular event. Now, how to place that within the overall context of the discussion in the Gemara is a fascinating question. You can have a look at the podcast if you want and hear the interview where we did go back and forth on what this might mean. But what is really significant, that's the kind of cool point, but the most important point is that the rabbis in Yavneh, perhaps with the divine assistance of this tsunami, make a clear distinction that this is how we are going to go forward. We're no longer going to be able to rely on sort of like everybody decides what they want. Am I going to be Beis Hillel? Am I going to be Beis Shammai? Now it's time, especially with the loss of the temple, that we have to come together for sure around our rabbinic leaders. The rabbinic leaders are deciding we're going to follow Beit Hillel, and so the development of this majoritarian consensus rule after debate becomes an exceptionally important element in the way that Jewish communities will organize themselves for the next 2,000 years. Just to be clear, the tsunami and all of the possible impact it had on the discussion that's recorded in Bava Metzia does not affect the central thrust of the meaning of that passage, which is to say that Lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven, that the Torah is here on the planet Earth, and human beings will debate it. Bringing a supernatural proof to advance your particular interpretation of Jewish law is not considered a valid argument, and therefore the rabbis will continue to maintain their standards, and this is a very important starting point for the organization of Jewry from there on after. But it's still very cool to think that a tsunami was happening at that time. There were two institutions that were especially important for the survival of the Jews after Yavneh. You can see in this map here that the sages from Yavneh, which is, you can see sort of on the lower left there, they've all spread out primarily to the north, where the majority of the Jewish population is going to be living after Bar Kokhba, but also some development in the south as well. The two institutions that they will ultimately coalesce around are the Sanhedrin and the Patriarchate. The Sanhedrin is the Jewish court that continued to function after the destruction of the temple, although it could not function in Jerusalem itself because Jews were forbidden to live there for a period of time. It moved, as you can see from these white arrows here, out to Yavneh and then up to the north, where it was located in a few different places till it finally settled in Tiberias, a relatively new city but a very important center of Jewish activity for the period that we're discussing today. Related to the Sanhedrin and sometimes overlapping in its leadership is the so-called Patriarchate, or Nesiyut in Hebrew. The Patriarchate is essentially the government of the Jews, which is led by a single individual, the Nasi. We don't have really good sense of exactly how it functioned. We also don't have a really good sense of the extent of its authority. We don't have a good sense of exactly how it related to the Roman government. There are some tantalizing elements of this relationship, in particular in the figure of one of the greatest of the Nesiim, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, as is sometimes related. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the prime figure organizing the codification of the Mishnah, which up until this point, as we mentioned, has been an oral document that has been transmitted by these Tana'im. He organized its codification into its textual form, its written form, which we have to this day. This happened around the year 200, perhaps 220 of the Common Era. And this is really the line that separates the Tana'im from the Amoraim. After the Mishnah is confirmed in writing, its primary exponents will be known as the Amoraim, and the documents that they will eventually produce are known as the Talmuds. One of them was produced in Israel, actually primarily in the northern region, to a certain degree on the coast, although it tends to be called the Yerushalmi or Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes the Palestinian Talmud. Both of those terms are kind of inaccurate or misleading in one way or another, but there is a Talmud created first in Israel, and then a later one, much larger one, in Babylonia, which will be the subject of the next two lectures. One of the challenges of studying this period is that we are essentially locked into rabbinic documents. To a certain degree, we have some Roman government documents, we have some church historians, but most of our really juicy sources are rabbinic in nature. And so the rabbis are primarily not interested in giving us history. They want to tell us about law, about religion, about faith, about philosophy. Those are the things that are, the primary energies of the rabbis at this time. We do have some chronologists like the Seder Olam, which is the Order of the World, one of the earliest chronologies compiled by the rabbis. We also have Megillat Tainit. We have a few ancient sources, but they're not really histories. They are kind of like, on this date this happened, on this date this happened, without really analyzing and fleshing out why things happened and so on. So when we look at other sources, we have, for example, the Babatha archive, which we discussed a little bit when we talked about Bar Kokhba. This is the archive of some 30 documents, primarily personal legal documents that were collected by a woman who was hiding with the Bar Kokhba rebels in the Cave of Letters. And what we can see from her archive is that while it's hard to generalize from one woman, we have another source, also a woman that comes from around this time as well. It seems that Jews were not hesitant to use non-Jewish courts, which suggests some limitation of the rabbi's authority. Obviously, they frowned on the abandonment of Jewish courts for Roman courts, or in this case, Nabatean and other courts. So perhaps there's a whole existence of Jews who are simply doing their own thing, following the dominant authority, which in this case would be the Romans, instead of listening to the rabbis. This would not be surprising. We just don't know the extent of it. We also have to realize that the Jews have a very problematic relationship with the Romans. On the one hand, heavily resenting the Romans for the depredation in their society. And on the other hand, the Romans, who have by this time, by the way, established 2 legions in Israel, which is a remarkably large number of people, about 10,000 soldiers, and they are cash heavy, meaning that they get paid in coin, and so they're extremely important for the local economy. They are resented by the population. The rabbinical sources give us a lot of descriptions of the abuse of the population by the Romans, but on the other hand, they're really essential to the economic realities of Israel. The Romans, as we shall discuss in a later lecture, are also extending certain privileges to certain classes of Jews. Makes a very big difference, and they're building roads, they're doing all kinds of infrastructure things that are useful for them as soldiers, but also useful for the economy as a whole. So there's a complex dynamic going on here that we don't know a lot about. We also get the sense, however, that even though we don't know for sure how extensive the authority of the rabbis are, there's no question that they have a phenomenal pull, that Judaism is a very competitive ideology at this time. Just for one example, have a look at Helena of Adiabene, who was a queen of this small kingdom you can see out here on the upper Tigris River. And Josephus tells us a lot about it. She also appears in the Talmud as Hilni Hamalka, that is Helene the queen. And she actually converts with her sons to Judaism, and she makes several trips to Jerusalem. She's known for her tremendous generosity. She gives to a lot of charity, and she chooses to be buried in Israel with this magnificent tomb. It was for a long time associated with someone else until they realized it was in fact Helena's tomb. Her sarcophagus was retrieved and is on display in the Israel Museum. So the thought that a very important, powerful political woman like Helena of Adiabene would convert to Judaism is just a sense of how, even during these very difficult times in the 1st century and onward, Judaism is still, quite appealing to the outside population. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. Let's go on in the next lecture to look at the development of the Babylonian Center in particular. Thank you very much for watching.